Okay, so now we're going to turn to aphasia evidence as it pertains to lexical access. So far we have our lexical entries which connect sound to meaning, and we've learned that that relationship in almost all cases is arbitrary. We use these representations both in production, so that's the situation in which we have a meaning in mind and we want to externalize that. We want to find the corresponding phonological representation. And then in the other direction, in comprehension, we have a form representation and we want to map that onto a meaning. So now I want to ask whether these links, so the green link or the blue link, can be impaired as a function of brain damage. And we actually do have specific aphasias that correspond to impairments in these two links. So on the production side, if you have an impairment in linking meaning to sound in production, that aphasia is called anomia. And so we'll talk about that. And then on the comprehension side, if you have an impairment in the other direction, so you're not able to map spoken words onto meanings, that aphasia is called transcortical sensory aphasia. And both of these aphasias can occur independently of the other, which kind of gives us evidence for separate arrows for the green root and the blue root. So now when we're talking about various tasks that might diagnose these aphasias, we of course also need to keep in mind that in a given task, you're probably not just operating the connection between sound and meaning, but the connection from the sound to the articulators, so actually programming the motor commands that allow you to say something will come into play when we're talking about anomia. And similarly, the lower level processes that allow you to go from the spoken signal to the phonological representation are also relevant on the comprehension side. So we're always going to be interested in at what level of processing is this impairment actually occurring. Okay, we're going to start on the comprehension side. So transcortical sensory aphasia, and I'm just going to keep our little lexical representation in mind here as we discuss this. So transcortical sensory aphasia, or TSA, is defined as an auditory comprehension deficit in the absence of phonological or semantic impairment. So these patients would show normal knowledge about the semantic properties of objects, which you can diagnose with various tests that don't necessarily include language, like here's a bunch of pictures and group the fruits on this side and the animals on that side, things like that. Similarly, their phonological knowledge is intact, so they would be able to make rhyming judgments and things like that that don't pertain to the meaning of words. Further, word repetition is in fact, so if they're given a phonological form, or if they hear a phonological form, so through the ear goes, you're able to construct the phonological form, you're then also able to output that form, so by articulation. So in some sense, that root is intact. So there you have to access the phonological representation, or maybe construct the phonological representation, but you don't have to engage with your semantic representations. So that sort of tells us that this system down here is operating. And naming is intact. So if you have a pure case of TSA without accompanying anomia, then your root from meaning to sound is intact. Okay, so that's a lot of green check marks. The only impairment that you have is the ability to link the phonological representation to the conceptual semantic representation. And so now we've talked about Wernicke's aphasia, which is, you know, kind of sounds similar because it's also a kind of a severe comprehension deficit. So one automatically wonders, like, well, what's the difference between TSA and Wernicke's aphasia? Wernicke's aphasia is generally thought to be kind of less crisp, more comprehensive language disorder. So, for example, typically in Wernicke's aphasia, repetition is impaired, whereas in a kind of a pure form of TSA, repetition should be intact. That's how you define it. TSA patients actually often exhibit so-called echolalia, which is that they, you know, they can't really understand the spoken language, and instead of the spoken language kind of making it all the way to meaning, they end up repeating it back. And so now it's a little hard to find an example of a TSA, an individual with TSA, but here's one example. You'll find it on YouTube. So let's listen to this person has exactly this kind of echolalia.
Let's go for a walk. So how are you today? Today, how? Watch your step, watch, step. Let's go feed the cats. Eating cats.
You get the idea. Okay, so TSA is actually quite rare, so does not occur in this kind of pure form very often, which has made systematic study of this disorder or this type of aphasia very difficult. So there are not a lot of kind of naturally occurring cases. We do, however, have a literature on this because it has been possible to induce the symptoms of TSA in the kind of pre-surgical function mapping that I've already mentioned briefly earlier. So there are some papers where pre-surgical patients whose the cortex around the planned resection is being mapped for function. So the doctors are trying to figure out, okay, exactly what is the contribution of this cortex to language processing. And the way they're doing it is via electrical interference, also called cortical stimulation, where the processing in that cortex is transiently interrupted. So there is a so-called transient functional lesion. So we transiently disrupt processing at a cortical site with an electric current, so only lasts a few seconds. And as I said, the goal is to understand function at a site that may need to be removed in surgery. So basically what we're trying to figure out is exactly, you know, how the borders of the resection should be drawn. So we call that pre-surgical function mapping or pre-surgical language mapping in the case of language. And while this clinical procedure takes place, it can also yield valuable data for basic science if the data are sort of properly documented. And the reason why these data are very valuable is because contrary to the techniques that we're mostly discussing in this course, so EEG, MEG, fMRI, PET a little bit, the nature of the cortical stimulation data is causal. So all of these non-invasive techniques only give us correlational data. So we have the subject or the experimental participant do some task, and then we observe what neural events or what kind of neural activity correlates with that task or the specific type of processing. That does not tell us that the say the activity increases that we're observing are causing the behavior. They could be sort of completely peripheral events to the actual process. And so causal data is very difficult to get from humans because we cannot go and, typically we can't interrupt brain processing in healthy individuals. And so this type of cortical stimulation or electrical interference is really the only technique that's available for humans that has really good spatial accuracy. And it is obviously only available in a very limited way since we can only use it in this patient population. There is another causal technique that is called TMS, and the difference there, that is sort of non-invasive, certainly a lot less invasive than this. And its spatial resolution is also much fuzzier than what we can see in cortical stimulation. Okay, so this is the technique that has actually yielded an interesting data set for TSA that has a systematicity that's hard to observe kind of in the wild. So this is work by Boatman colleagues, and so this is data from a 2000 paper. So here they're observing, the question is, at what cortical sites do we elicit the symptomology of TSA? And so here we have a bunch of patients, and so now they have electrodes implanted as part of the pre-surgical planning. It's 6 patients, so these studies never have a lot of participants. It's usually pretty small sample studies. Let's keep our little lexical model in mind here. The tasks that these patients are performing kind of run the whole, or cover the whole range of the way that these arrows run in my example. So they're tested on repetition. So we already went over that. So going from the auditory stimulus straight to articulation doesn't really involve the semantics. Picture naming, so you would get a picture, you have to name it, so you're following the green route. Word and paragraph reading, so this is reading aloud. I don't have the orthographic representation here now, but that's, obviously a type of comprehension task as well, but does not include the auditory representation. Spontaneous speech, so there, instead of having this kind of a picture naming task, the person is asked to, just talk about some, like, let's say, what did you do yesterday, or something like that. Syllable discrimination, here we're interested in the phonological level, so are you able to tell syllables apart from each other, cat, pat, something like that. And then auditory comprehension. So now that last task is the crucial task for diagnosing TSA. So there, you're trying to engage the blue root. In this case, the auditory comprehension task was one in which they had to follow simple commands like move the green square. And you should immediately observe that that's, of course, a more complicated task than understanding a single word, like in my example here. So there are other components that are relevant to that task, like your ability to put words together. So that's something that matters for the interpretation of these results, but that just happened to be what they did. So there wasn't like a single word comprehension task or something like that. So now the results were that, so now remember here, there was kind of like this bigger left hemisphere cloud. And now when we're looking at the electrodes on which all the tasks were intact, except the auditory comprehension task, we get this kind of a data set, or set of results. So these are the sites, sort of like, middle, superior temporal cortex, a decent amount of variability between the patients, on which all the tasks were intact except their ability to do the auditory comprehension task. So that's the only one that was impaired. And so now these types of data have importantly informed our models of lexical processing in the brain. So for example, an influential model by Hickok and Puppel, their kind of original version of it was very informed by these results. So they postulated that the kind of sound meaning interface of language is localized exactly in a type of area that sort of conforms to the TSA results from, say, like Boatman studies. So these findings have, had impact in models of language in general. Okay, so now let's then move on to the production side. What does anomia look like? Let's start with a little clip again. It's going to be very different.
Hi, Catherine. Nice to meet you. I'm Nicole. I'm a speech therapist. Hi, nice to meet you. How are you? I'm doing good. Yeah. It's a little hard, but I'm getting there. I'm sure it is, but we're going to work through it, and your parents are going to help us, and I think that we'll be able to get you back into the school and independent and get your life back. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is something called semantic features analysis. It sounds really hard and scary, but it's really simple. I'm just going to show you a picture or an object, and I'm going to ask you different questions, and you're going to tell me about it. And we're going to try and fire the connections in your brain to think of what the word is when you're having trouble thinking of a word. Okay? So we're going to start really simple, and then I'm going to make it a little harder by adding things from the school system. Your mom told me that you used to be a teacher. So I'd like you to try to remember those words so we can get you back into schools. Okay. Okay, so here's a little map, and all these pictures, they show different things. So we have shapes and size and what it sounds like and what it's used for. So we're going to go through each thing. Your first object is this. Can you think of a name for that? No. Okay, so first, what shape is it? It's round. It's round. Okay, why don't you write down underneath that it's round? Okay, where could you find it? Sometimes it's in my kitchen. Yeah, you can find it in your kitchen. Okay, so why don't you write down kitchen? Who could use it? I could use it. I like to eat it sometimes. Yeah, you eat it? So actually, you can write that right here, that you eat it. What does it look like, Catherine? It's orange. It's orange. What else? Why don't you feel it? What's it feel like? It's hard. It's hard. Okay. Can you smell anything? It smells sweet. Does it smell familiar? Have you smelled that before? I think so. Okay. Why don't you write down some of the things you just told me? Okay, so look at everything that you've told me. You've told me it's round, it's hard, it smells sweet, you find it in your kitchen, you can eat it. Can you think of the word for it, Catherine? Keep looking at all of your clues. Is it an orange? It is. It's an orange. Say it again. Orange. Write it down. What is it? It's an orange. Here, hold it and say it again. It's an orange. Good job.
Okay, it's super interesting, right? She is able to kind of circle around this specific word that seems like a very easy word to name, and her language seems so very normal until she hits this particular item that is she's just not able to say the word, and that this is a therapy session, so the therapist is trying to kind of help her revive some of those lexical representations. So the really interesting aspect of anomia is that it often affects very specific semantic domains. And so here, that was just one example where this particular fruit was really hard to name for the for this person. But so, like fruits and vegetables, that can be a semantic domain that's affected in anomia. Tools, oftentimes the specificity of the domains just seems kind of crazy. And it's one of the more fascinating findings that we have in the neuroscience of language in general. So in anomia, it's not usually the case that your route from sound to meaning is in general impaired, but rather the connection from meaning to sound is impaired for some meanings. And the fact that it is semantically defined, so the scope of the disorder tends to be semantically defined in the sense that it's only some semantic domains that are affected, suggests that it is this first arrow as opposed to the second arrow that is affected. It would be much harder to impose a sort of a semantic constraint on the phonological form to articulation connection. So anomia can arise from many different types of left hemisphere damage. So as is common in aphasia, there's no one-to-one mapping between lesion site and this type of disorder. And this does sort of speak to attention that has a very long history in cognitive neuroscience in general for many different domains, including in lexical representation, between so-called distributed versus localized theories of function. So on the one hand, we have evidence that semantic representations and lexical representations kind of live all over the cortex, so that would be a distributed model, versus various results that suggest that we can also find localization. So for example, with the TSA results, and the model that I showed you afterwards, there's this claim that there's a particular place in the brain, more posterior temporal cortex, that houses this sound to meaning interface in some sense. So that would be a localized hypothesis. So which is right? Well, most likely there's some truth to both. So for example, it's possible that our brains have certain types of hubs that then pool together or bind together features that are represented in a more distributed fashion. And so here's just one example of that type of a model that kind of combines both of those views. In this model from Patterson and colleagues from 2007, and there's lots of further versions of this model. The left anterior temporal lobe, so not the same region that we looked at earlier, but more anterior temporal cortex, serves as a semantic hub that binds together features from various cortical locations. So here's the hub, and here are then a more distributed space of representations that can then kind of come together by some kind of a binding operation in the anterior temporal cortex. So now the left anterior temporal lobe is actually very rarely damaged in stroke, and that just has to do with our vascular anatomy. But it can atrophy in neurodegenerative disorders. So those kinds of aphasias are called progressive aphasias. So they are ones that, become, typically from aphasia, you kind of, when you acquire it due to stroke, there's a, you recover to some extent, but these you kind of get worse the older you get. When cortex in the left anterior temporal lobe atrophies in these disorders, that tends to cause loss in the specificity of your semantic knowledge. And so that's often called semantic dementia or semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia. So this kind of an individual, instead of, if they're talking, they might not be able to access the word apple, and so then they would go for a more general description like fruit. Instead of poodle, they would just say dog. Instead of sofa, they might just say furniture, or even further, for all these things, they could just say thing. So the output of these kinds of patients can sound very generic, like they're just, you know, using kind of very vague generic vocabulary. And so now today, if we look at the literature more broadly, there's a reasonable amount of consensus that our brains probably have multiple of these kinds of binding hubs. And most likely the anterior temporal lobe, but also the posterior temporal cortex function as some kind of integrative binding hubs that combine features that perhaps themselves have a more distributed representation. And so next what we'll move on to is exactly discussing the neural correlates of lexical access, not from aphasia, but from neuroimaging and imaging most